That way I get as many images as possible. The more images you can take, the better. In particular, what I'll usually do is after I'm done flying the automated route, and I'll show you guys that in a little bit, I'll go back to that same elevation and I'll point the camera at an angle and just kind of rotate and take photos. You can see an example of that here. So on the left side is where all the photos that were taken for this site that we're going to be talking about were at. And you can see there's a lot of overlap, and the circles there are where I took the drone up to that elevation and would take photos just kind of panning around. So the key really is get as many photos from as many different angles as possible. On the right, that's a hospital campus that I recently flew, and the green lines on there is the path that the drone's gonna take. And during that entire flight, it's shooting at an angle. It's not shooting straight down. I've got a separate flight that I do that's just the straight down. So altogether for that site on the right-hand side was about 45 minutes to an hour in the air to get the entire site straight down in angles. I don't have that one in here right now. I'm still processing that one through some other projects. But this one on the left is one that we're going to be talking about. So, what's that? The one on the left was about 600. The one on the right altogether was just shy of 1,000. So one of the other keys is to fly as low as possible. It does take longer to fly, but obviously you get a much better quality. So you got to kind of balance those two. How many batteries do you have? How long can you fly versus your quality? All right. And one other issue with flying so much is obviously, like I said, that one on the right, that was almost an hour of straight flying at 90+ degrees temperature outside. And by the end of it, the drone, my iPad, and the controller were all overheating. So just watch out for that if you're doing a lot of flying. That's kind of fairly typical with most drones, though. So using the drone data, we use Drone Deploy primarily for our automated flights and image capture. We also use Pix4D. There's a couple other programs out there. Really doesn't matter what you use. Most of them will have some sort of way to process that into a point cloud. If not, I believe Recap does. It used to do a photogrammetry. So regardless of what you're using, you're going to need to export that out as a point cloud. Typically an XYZ format is the most standard and widely used. So we can take that out of, in this case, Drone Deploy and into Recap, into an RCP file. And that's all I did. Just pulled it out, open it in Recap, hit Save As. That was it. It takes a while to run that process, but that's as simple as it is because it's only one point cloud. So unlike if you're using a laser scanner where you've got, 5, 10, 20, whatever that you need to register and overlap, this is one and all that work's already done for you. To kind of show you what that looks like inside a Recap, that same photo we saw on the left, that's the site there. There's about a 20-foot elevation from where the grid is in the middle of the field down to the lowest part of the road. You can see kind of there's a building, utility building hidden back right up here. So that building is an entire floor below the main entrance up here. So once we've got that point cloud out of Recap, we can link that into Revit. And now you've got a point cloud in Revit. Okay, great. Now what do I do with it? Well, that's where the magic happens. And there's a plugin called Scan Terrain. It's, I think, $4.99 for the full version and worth every penny of it. It's got 2 little buttons. You do that. You select the terrain you want with a couple of very simple settings. The big one that I found makes a difference is actually the point spacing down here. I like about 3 feet because I want a fairly detailed topo surface. But for this site, that generated over 20,000 points. By the way, it took all the surface. I've got my full trees like that. Or it's not perfect. Little divots in. There's actually trees there. And then actually, if you look at the point cloud out here, there just aren't that many points to it because there were so many trees there that it cut out. It didn't have enough ground surface. But it's still, that's a heck of a lot better and a heck of a lot faster than trying to do it by hand. And then, of course, you can do things with it, adding building pads. It then turns into that. So now I've got my roads, I've got my sidewalks, I've cut out where the new building's going to be, and I'm able to then work with it how I need to. Also, because it is a very heavily sloped site, we had sloped driveways, things like that. So using slabs with the sub points in it to get that kind of complex cross slope allowed us to actually take that into Revit. And there you can see our final product. And over here by the new garage, you can see where all the sub points.
there's not very many things that you can do. You know, if you have a link file in another file, this is one of the very few things that you can actually put it back to the original file. You're going to do it by trade. Cool. That makes sense. So once you're not using the Revit engine anymore, you can link it or report it. That's the lesson. If you point off of the Revit origin, now you have to always use shared coordinates to link everything back together. So now you kind of manually decided where that baseline is for your project. Does that make sense? It's all highlighted on. All right. So that's kind of the best way to set up a single building. Now you have so what I have is I started out with a site. So in the site file, you can link in your file if you want to, and then I will draw out the property line inside of, because when you have the CADD inside this, when you link this into other files, the CADD is not going to show up. So you need something that's actually in the model to show that into the building. So here I have campus. another model. And I click on this one, and it now it will this only work if you don't have multiple coordinate positions. The next one, this command you're taking it in until you exit out, like it's kind of default. And then I'm done. Okay. So now when I go to save my file, it's going to ask me the same thing. We're going to save these coordinate positions back to my I'll give that each one when you do this, make sure that the other models are all closed so that you don't have to choose. So you'll notice that it saved them, right? It came back a file because it actually saved back to the room. So now if I go in here and I go to insert and I say link Revit, it'll link in this campus site. I'm going to make sure that I can select show. So notice that I put in exactly what I want. Right? The new word. Now, what I do here is this is my project board for this building, right? So I need to set the set. So we do that, go over here to the orientation, and we change this project board to and then we go to manage position and rotate. We're going to go here. And notice that it rotated it all nice, right? And then I can turn this back. Project North, and it rotates the whole thing so that it's set to Project North. All right, I'm going to save this. I'm going to save this one back too. And then, oh, didn't mean to open 19. Close that one. I'll do the same thing to building C. So insert, link Revit, pick the campus, make sure it's shared coordinates. Okay. All right. Then I do the same thing. I change the orientation to true north. It's a little bit counterintuitive, like which one it has to be set to, yeah, rotate it. Rotate true north. I take this edge, I put it on there. Set this back to Project North, rotates the whole thing, and I save it. Okay, so here's one funny quirk. If I go back over here and I just reload all of these, it doesn't look like anything happened. You actually have to close it and open it again, and then everything's in the right spot. I'll show you. Close it, open it. It's happy. It's what? It's a feature. Okay, it's a feature. It's a quirk. I don't know. I tried this a whole bunch of times, and finally I was like, I closed it and opened it again, and it fixed it. So it's just something that the reload doesn't work. You just have to close it to reset it properly. So yeah, so that's kind of the best way to set up the campus. Now, if you already have your buildings and they're already kind of modeled wherever, you can do this exact same thing, and you just have to, kind of ignore that Revit origin again, kind of what I showed you with the single building. And we did that earlier. I did that earlier on a real project, and it all worked out fine. Now, if one of the things I do want to mention, if you're doing this and you need to do all this stuff, and your consultants have already started modeling, then they should already have your model linked into theirs, origin to origin. So when you've moved this model and you've pushed the coordinates from the site model to that model, those shared coordinates now live in there. So what the consultants can do is they can actually just acquire the coordinates from the architecture link. And once they do that, then if you take their mechanical model and link it back into here, it'll go in the right spot. So it is something that can be done after the fact. And it's much easier to do it, you know, if you haven't moved stuff. It's kind of, you know, I always say in Revit, we follow the KISS principle, right? So like, just don't change stuff if you don't have to, because then when you have to, it's much easier to change it, right? Like when you start a building, if you don't know what your first floor elevation is, just leave it at 0. And then once you know it, use relocate project and move it then. So you only have to move it once, right? So it's just stuff like that where if you don't know something, you know, just don't change it. You know, like if you're building an existing building, always start with generic walls, adjust them when you need to. It kind of goes back to that. You should always kind of stay simple, because it's much easier in Revit to take something that's simple and make it more complicated than to take something that's complex and uncomplicated. I've worked with so many examples. I mean, every project I ever did in practice was an existing building. My background is in historic preservation along with architecture. And so every single project I've ever done has had that existing building component in it. And I've seen a lot of issues where things were built incorrectly, and then they had to be changed, and it would just break everything. And a couple of times models were just completely rebuilt because they just couldn't be fixed. So it's much, much better to start simple and make it more complex as needed. So I think that's kind of the end of my presentation. What do we learn? Set them up early. Be deliberate about it, for sure. Make sure that your entire team understands how to set them up. So if you have specific instructions, type them out and send them to your consultants when you send them the models, and say, this is how you need to link my model into your template to make sure that everything is going to line up properly. And then, you know, and sometimes if it's just messed up too bad, you can't fix it. Like, it's just one of those things that's just really complicated inside of Revit. And, you know, I before I started, I was asking my colleagues, like, throw some scenarios at me that I can think about. And, you know, one of my colleagues was like, well, what if the architect just doesn't want to move the building? And I'm like, well, in that case, that's your answer right there, that last point, because you can't use logic to fix something that's not logical. So, and you can always move those points. That's what I'm saying. Like, you can take the project base point, and if you somewhere random in your building and you want to move it, you know, unclip it, move it, you know, and then you can publish those coordinates to your other models, and they'll all be fine. But of course, it's always better just to do it that way from the beginning. So, any questions?
Have you experimented with models where one of the models was miles out of where it's supposed to be, trying to get it back?
Like no, and that's just one of those instances where if it's like it really again goes back to, you know, where it is relative to the Revit origin. So if it's here, if the Revit origin is here and it's like 3 miles in outer space, if you catch it early enough and you can literally move the building, that's better. Because you're going to get graphic problems. That's the issue, is that for some weird reason, drafting patterns break down when you get really far from the Revit origin.
I can tell you why. The patterns that are created, graphic patterns, usually are they're not an even number with space things.
Yeah.
So they get rounded in the process of locating them.
That makes sense.
So what happens is, the further you get away from the origin, they start counting the origin of the pattern. The more that error.
The rounding error adds up.
Things are falling apart.
Okay. But it was weird because when I tested it, it depended on the scale of the view too. And I think that makes sense though with the rounding error. Like the further away you get, well, it's because I think the origin for drafting patterns is the Revit origin, right? That's why if you have multiple objects with the same drafting pattern, they look like the pattern flows into each other, because they're using a central origin point as the origin for the pattern. So it makes sense.
AutoCAD has the same issue.
Okay.
If your pattern's too far from the origin, it starts to break apart. All that has to do with the math.
It makes sense. That totally makes sense. I've not worked on, things that were miles long before. So, but that blog post that I mentioned that I wrote it off of was off of a help desk case where they had modeled something like 2 miles away from the Revit origin and we're having all these weird pattern issues. So
Everything you showed us was coordinating different models together, like on a campus or a single building or whatever. Do you have experience locating models in the real world using GIS? And are you aware of the differences between pre-Revit 2018 and after 2018 and being able to locate those models? Have you dealt with that process at all and bringing it into GIS?
Not into GIS, but I have done a presentation. Actually, Donnie and I did a presentation at AU last year, and we're doing it again this year on coordinating civil files with Revit and how you can locate that survey point to an actual surveyed location. So I mentioned earlier, right, that it doesn't matter where the survey point is relative to the Revit origin. It can be 5 miles out all the way over there. And so that workflow actually uses a survey point in the civil file, which is based off of a real location on the earth, right? And through this workflow with a couple of plugins that you have to use, it will take that survey point in Revit and locate it in the same location as the survey point in the civil file. So then you are geolocating your project on the planet. But I have not done it's on my list to play with there's a connector now to ArcMap that Autodesk has, and that's one of the things that is on my list of things to figure out.
Yeah, Revit 2018 can acquire points directly from like CAD models and stuff like that. And I've played with it a little bit. I'm by no means an expert, nor is that what I do all the time, but it's definitely a lot easier than the
previous.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's good to know. Yeah, and that's the problem with the coordinates is you do them like one time on a project, right? And then you don't do it again for a year until you work on the next project. And so it's something that's really complicated and you don't do it very often. So that compounds it, definitely.
One thing I would suggest is putting 3 reference planes on 2. One from horizontal.
That makes sense.
Zero. Start with sections and you have a side
That's a good point.
different elevations, we're gonna need that reference.
That makes sense. So yeah, so for those watching online, adding a horizontal reference plane also is useful so that when you're starting to work in the Z direction, you can find where that origin is. That makes sense. Definitely. Cool.
Where else?